Church. I'm a visiting curator of urban history at the Newport Historical Society and the author of Newport, the Artful City, which explores Newport through its maps, paintings, illustrations, and photographs, and how artists and writers through time have celebrated this urban work of art. In this video, we look at the evolution of the Point, which was a district in Newport adjacent to the harbor developed by the Society of Friends in the early 18th century. If one looks at an early map of the Point, one sees it's a grid system. This idea of the grid was predominant in British colonial North America. The grid has a long urban history behind it. It dates back to the days of ancient Greece and Rome. It is an easy, efficient way to plan your community. Now, did the Society of Friends know about the ancient Greeks and Romans? They were quite learned, but I think what really appealed to colonists across the board was the sense of efficiency in the grid plan. And what may have appealed to the Society of Friends specifically was the sense in how they developed the Point District, the idea of modesty and equality. The lots were of relative equal size, and the Society of Friends also began that tradition in America of naming streets after trees. And in the records of the Society of Friends of Newport, they said we should, and I paraphrase, but we should seek out our brethren in Philadelphia to see about their city plan. William Penn, member of the Society of Friends, in laying out Philadelphia in the late 17th century, created a grid plan and named the streets after trees. As the Point evolved over time, it was at first a mercantile center for sea trade. And of course, Newport dominated in the sea trade in the 18th century. As the centuries moved on, by the mid-19th century, a new occurrence appeared in Newport, and that was the development of the train. The railroad came to Newport in 1867, and the Point became the terminus for the Old Colony Railroad, which then linked into steamships. So now the Point became this industrial nexus of new technology. And in the aerial photograph of the Point, we see the cove slowly being filled in to accommodate the new technology of the railroad. But in this photograph, it's a very poignant image because on the left-hand side of the photograph, you have technology in the form of that railroad and steamships. But on the right, you have the older 18th century cityscape of wooden houses going literally almost right into the water. Two very different technologies at work. In addition to technology and industry, something else was beginning to happen on the Point in the mid-19th century. In the 1870s, American architects and writers were beginning to romanticize the colonial era. As America was searching and crafting its own national identity, its own cultural imagery, architects, writers, and others were looking to the colonial period. We were almost 100 years old as a nation, and the Point had one of the largest collections of 18th century houses extant. The architect Charles McKim began to photograph colonial architecture in Newport, and the writer Thomas Wentworth Higginson wrote a novel called Old Port, which takes place on the Point in Newport. As one looks down the lush tree-lined streets of the Point in 19th century photographs, one can imagine the words of Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who once wrote that, and I paraphrase, one could feel the ghosts of the past. During the American Revolution, several of the grand houses on the Point, notably the Robinson House seen in the photograph, were used to house French officers. The Vicomte de Noailles lived at the Robinson House and was purported to have a great flirtation with Thomas Robinson's daughter, Hannah Robinson. Now, in the romantic guise of the age, she represented a freshness and a naturalness, and in contrast, the ladies of the French court, who these officers would have known. The point is, the architect McKim and Thomas Wentworth Higginson, the writer, creating a romantic world, an imagined 18th century past on the Point. What's key about this is that as modern technology developed Newport, artists and writers were codifying the past. It's a very interesting interplay of old and new in this remarkably preserved district.